Hey folks, welcome back to the Engineered Angler and Happy New Year. Welcome to 2021. Hopefully the world will do a little better this year. Anyway, today we're going to be working on a kind of a technical crankbait. We're going to do a crankbait designed to cast a long ways, and we're going to accomplish that with a little bit of shaping and a lot of weight shift. If that's something you're interested in, stick around. So typically I'll go through the whole design process from the first line, but since this one is going to take a little time and a lot of explaining, I wanted to sort of cut to the chase and not do a bunch of drawing. All right, so let me just sort of state my purpose here. I want to create a crankbait that's about 5 inches long and that will cast a long way. I want to be able to fish it off the beach and get it beyond the breakers. So it needs to have a couple of things, right? It's got to have a little bit of weight, and it has to have a really low wind drag. And it's critical where that weight is. I really need the weight to be towards the tail as it's flying, but I need it to come back towards the head when it's cranking so it doesn't affect how well it wiggles in the water. So that's why the weight shift. And as far as wind drag, well, the most aerodynamic shape is going to be that streamlined shape we've discussed in other videos. And that's essentially is a shape that is sort of blunt at one end and pointed at the other and symmetric about the center line. And so most of you recognize that shape. It's very typical of wing shapes and anything underwater, right? If you know about sailboats, that might be the cross section of a rudder or a keel. But since that would fly in that direction, and that would mean that I would have to have my bib on the front like that, the lure would not behave how I would want it to on retrieve. So we have to have some sort of compromise. And so my compromise is, instead of having the wide point way back about 1/3 from the back of the lure, I'm going to have it exactly in the center. So it's essentially a symmetric shape about that center line and this center line. I'm hoping that with the weight shift and this shape and the natural drag that goes with a lure like this, the bib and this belly hook, that I'll achieve a lure that will fly tail first, nice and straight, and not want to veer off that path. One of the critical things about making a lure like this is that I'm taking up so much space with this chamber that's going to be a sliding area for these ball weights. It really limits the amount of weight I can add to it afterwards. So that means I really have to have a good idea of what the density of the wood's going to be, more or less the volume of this body, so that I don't get stuck later with a lure that floats too much. I want a lure that will be relatively neutral or almost suspending, maybe slightly floating in salt water, which would mean that would probably sink in fresh water. So I played around with the idea of using oak because it's dense, it's hard, but I have very little of it, and I really don't like the way it finishes on the lathe. So I'm going to use this stuff. This is lumquat, and it's a very hard wood. In fact, the density, I've already worked it out, is 0.89, and that's pretty doggone dense, considering some of the hardest woods are only about 0.9. So this is really one of the more dense hardwoods that I have, at least, and that I would want to use, be honest with you. Right, so as you're looking at these calculations, you'll see these little blocks. Well, that's the dimensions for this little block of wood that I cut out from a piece of lumquat. And all I've done is figured out the volume so I can get the density on it. And I did all that so that I can then figure out what I'm going to be removing, right? So I know the dimension of my rattle chamber, and I know how big of a bore I'm going to drill into it, how long. So I know how much wood I'm removing, and I know how much weight I'm adding with my chamber. And let me show you that. So the way I'm going to achieve this internal weight shift sort of chamber is by making just an elongated version of what I typically use for rattles. And this is just a piece of drinking straw. And inside of it, there's just 3 steel balls, just like these. And on the end of the straw, I've glued a small magnet. As you can hear, those balls aren't moving around unless I give it a little more acceleration. And then they slide to the back. And so this will be in here like this, and the magnet will be up near the head. And as I fling it, it'll send those 3 balls to the end. Now what that means for actual weight shifting is about 4 grams will go from just forward of what would normally be the center of gravity to just aft or well aft of what would be the center of gravity, which hopefully will help keep it aligned with the wind flow as it's flying. That's the theory. Hopefully it works. Step 1 will be to lathe out this shape. The major dimensions are on the board, so if you want to try to copy what I'm doing, you can use these dimensions. It's going to be 5 inches long, 3/4 inches at the widest point, and the widest point is right in the center, halfway between the nose and the tail. The chamber, the sliding chamber, is 2.5 inches long, and then it's placed, the tail end of that chamber is 1 inch behind the tail, and that's just there for convenience. It does allow me for just a little space in between the bib and the belly hook to add a little bit of weight if I need it. The next step for me is to draw up a sort of a profile of dimensions, and how I do that is I'll break this lure up into stations or partitions just like you would with a hull design on a boat. What I'll do is I'll draw this out on a piece of tape and place the dimensions at each one of these stations, and I'll put that on my lathe, right on my tool stand, and those stations and dimensions will line up with the piece of wood as I'm lathing it, unless I make a stupid mistake. All right, so this is my mini lathe. It's not the greatest machine in the world, but it does the job, especially for little things like lures. So the first thing I'm going to do with the piece of wood is I'm going to true it up a little bit. It's pretty close to true, and hopefully those numbers show up. If not, take my word for it. I've written the dimensions at each one of these points, but I'm going to have to clean it up and then get that bore drilled in the middle and mark how deep it's going to be. So all that has to be done pretty precisely so I don't end up with the bore going too far forward. I'm going to keep truing it up just a little farther, and then I need to drill that center bore. So now if this is the head and that's the tail, then I know that the end of my chamber ends right at about 1 inch in from the tail. So I'll mark that as well. And I know that's how far I can go in with my bore. All right. Well, I inserted this bit to the chuck exactly the depth I needed, so I've got this thing drilled out now, and we should be able to get this thing shaped up pretty quickly. All right, so the center is right here, and I've got these kind of rusty old calipers set to 3/4 of an inch, and I just need to bring this down a slight bit more, probably not much more because I need some room for sanding and such, and then we got to dive it into the ends, and that's probably the most delicate part. All right, so before we get too far along, I've got to get the weight shift chamber inside this thing, because if not, I can't bring the tip all the way to the end. So let's do it. All right, to do that, I'm just going to drop it in to a little bit of resin. I'm not going to use a two-part glue type resin. I'm going to actually use the casting resin that I use to make the lures because it pours easily and it sets up in just a few minutes. All right, I dropped it in there and now I'm just pouring in the resin, and I'm going to make sure it stays nice and connected to the very end. That's where I need it, so it looks like it's going to stay there. I expect this will froth up a little bit. We'll see. If it doesn't fill all the way up beyond the end of the lure, I'll put a little more in there. All right, well, I've got it back on the lathe after I put in that weight shift chamber, and I'm just refining the taper a little bit. It's important that I never get into that chamber, but I think it'll work pretty well. Right now, all I have to do is continue to taper to the ends, and it's all kind of fussy and a little bit boring to watch. So I'm gonna go ahead and start shaping this thing a little more seriously, and then we'll come back to it when I'm starting to sand and get that final shape. All right, it's coming out okay. I had a little issue. It cracked in the middle of the shaping and it's holding together. I put a little bit of glue on it and it's holding together. I think I'll be able to shape it the rest of the way just with sandpaper. So now it's a matter of getting the eye locations in, and I'm gonna, while it's on here, I'm gonna go ahead and cut in the bib slot, or the lip slot. All right, so I've got it shaped, sanded down as nicely as I could get it. This guy was just giving me a hard time. I put a big gouge in it, and then I cracked it. And anyway, it's been a semi-disaster, but it's recovering. And now it's time to try to figure out how much weight to add. So I'm gonna do some calculations. And since I have the density of the wood, I'm gonna weigh this, and that'll give me the volume of this shape. All right, so first things first, we'll go ahead and weigh the body of the lure, and it weighs 25.94 grams. Now, I have to subtract from it the difference between what I drilled out and what I put into it, which is actually 3.92 grams, which equals 22.02. And going out 2 decimal points is a little bit extreme and almost meaningless, so we'll just call it 22 grams. Now I need to know what the volume of the lure body is. And to get that, all I got to do is take the weight of the body and divide it by the density of the wood. I'm going to divide 22 by the density. It comes out to 24.6 centimeters cubed. So since water weighs 1 gram per centimeter cube, the lure has to weigh exactly 24.6 grams, theoretically, to be perfectly neutral in the water. So that said, we already know the lure body alone weighs 25.94. But it's my experience that it always takes a little more weight than the theoretical weight. And I think it's because of just sort of bubbles on the surface and bubbles that get caught up in the hardware. So I'm expecting that this lure body will float the way it is, I think. But the question is, will it float with all the hardware? And I won't be able to answer that until I have this sealed, because I don't want to get water in the wood. So I'm going to seal it with a thin coat of UV resin, because that'll give me a good protective coating and won't take very long to set. So I'm going to do that now. All right, so I've got the temporarily mounted hook eyes, and I've got this thing mounted on my lure holder, and I've been putting a good thick coat resin on here, and I'm filling in all the gaps so that I'm sure I won't absorb water. And now I can just let it turn, and hopefully in about 20 minutes with the lights on, I can come back and start work on it again. All right, it's been long enough. Here's what it looks like. Pretty shiny, I'm surprised. So my expectations, since right now all the weight is forward in my little weight shift chamber, is that it'll go a little bit head down, or maybe even a lot head down. Look at that, it actually sinks. Well, that's not that great. So we just saw that it sinks with those temporary eyes in it, but the calculations show that it should float the way it was. So let's see if my calculations are right. I'm a little nervous. Oh my, it just barely floats. Look at that. It just barely floats. If I drop it, it'll go to the bottom and just slowly come up. Well, that gives me a little bit of hope. It tells me that if I keep my hardware really light and do my best not to add too much weight in paint and fixins, we can maybe have a lure that is just barely buoyant in salt water. And we'll test that as soon as I get a chance to make some seawater. So I need to mix some salt water, some seawater, so I can test this lure in the environment it's going to be in. Although I got a feeling it's not going to make much of a difference, but I still want to see how much slower it actually sinks. Salt water has about 3.5% of its weight in salt. I'm going to put in 3.5 liters of water in here, and I'll use this 500 milliliter cup to measure the water. To make this formula work, I'm going to use 3,380, more or less, milliliters of water and about 122.5 grams of salt. And that'll get us pretty close. Happily, this is just a prototype. It's certainly been the scene of some disaster. So I had that big crack where my lathing tool gouged it a little bit, and I gouged it with the bandsaw. So it's definitely seen some hard times already. These holes on top are because I always drill all the way through when I'm inserting these twisted screw eyes. And that's because when I'm gluing in these eyes, it's really nice to have sort of a drain hole, an air hole, for you to really see that the glue has come all the way through and is fully encasing that screw eye. Plus, you're able to get the longest length of screw eye in the wood that you possibly can. I'm going to wipe it down, and I'm going to wipe the inside of this slot. And before we get painting, I'm going to go ahead and put the dive bib in there and then tape it off. All right, we'll use some silver here. This is actually wicked aluminum. All right, we got a pretty good silver finish on it right now. Pretty happy with that. All right, let's move on to turning it a little bit gold around the eyes, sort of the nose, the eyes, and just slightly back, maybe just before this belly hook. And this is just a transparent orange. Pretty good to me. Now I'm going to start to work on the green. All right, I put the mesh on, and now we're going to use some of this transparent green. This is one of the Badger paints, one of their ghost colors. It's a transparent green. That looks really nice. Now it's just a matter of to obscure those really hard lines so it isn't quite as kind of toy-like. So I'm going to use another of the Badger paints. This is another one of the ghost colors, which are all transparent. This one is sort of a very deep purplish blue, almost looks black. It's so dark. But my idea is to darken the scales on top and just sort of make it look a little less harsh. And I'll top it with some black, but I'll try to keep the black top kind of narrow, and then I'll put a black spot here. And I'm going to give it a little bit of sort of a halo around the eye, just to give it a little more prominence. And then a little bit of red or orange on the chin, and we'll be done. All right, let's put a strike eye on it. All right, now I'm just gonna set that with the blow dryer, get the eyes on it, and then I'll put a mid coat of polyacrylic all over it, and we'll let that dry for a couple hours, and then we'll put a clear coat on it. All right, well, it's the next day, and it's time to pull this out of here. So it's looking pretty good. It's not the most beautiful lure I've ever made, and I probably could have done a little more sanding, but it looks pretty nice actually. Not too shabby. It's time to do a little more testing, right? So we have a little bit of an ocean in a tank. I'll pull this tape off, and then I'm gonna test it without the hooks just to see if it looks different, and then we'll put the hooks on and see how it looks. And then, as you can see, the day is not a pretty day. It's gray. It's been gray all morning. All right, let's get this show on the road here. Here's our saltwater tank. It's not as clear as I was hoping it was going to be, but that's probably mostly my fault because I really didn't clean this tank how I should have. It's still kind of nasty. So here comes a moment of truth, right? I'm totally expecting it to go head down because that's essentially how I made it. I'm taking notes though on the things I'll do differently when I make the next one. Of course, you gotta remember this is just a prototype and I'm learning from this prototype. All right, let's see how it does. Well, it certainly suspended a little longer before it went to the bottom. That's a good sign. That means that I'm gonna have a little more time to play the lure in mid-water and it won't like just sink to the bottom on me. That's a good deal. Hopefully that means I won't hang it up on a rock and lose it first time out. All right, let's hear what it sounds like when I actually get the weights to shift. You can actually hear them pretty well. So that's a good sign. And they don't move unless I really give it a good swat. So let's get some hooks on it and get to the dock. Whew. All right, it's getting chilly out there. All right, I went down to the dock for a preliminary sort of tuning session and it started to drizzle. So our plans to be on the dock with camera gear is a no-go. So unfortunately the weather isn't working with us, but I can tell you I'll have to do a follow-up video on this so I can get some underwater shots. The cast, I gotta say, I'm not noticing a big difference in how long it casts. Obviously, I'm not going to be doing a scientific study on it, but you know, after you've been casting lures for, you know, the better part of half a century, you get a little bit of a feel for it. And I'm thinking, you know, it may not be worth it to do these weight shifts, but I have to give it a little more time, a few more casts. The action on it is a little muted, not exactly kind of the bigger action I was looking for. Of course, that might be because I kind of put a small bib on it and it's also a long lure. So what I might do is make some adjustments, and since this isn't like a beautiful lure anyway, I might just modify this one. Maybe put a bigger bib on it, maybe even move the tow eye a little bit. But that'll be the subject of another video. So until next time, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like the video if you did, and subscribe if you haven't subscribed, and certainly comment and offer suggestions if you've got some. I'll see you next time.